This is number 16 off linear applications, and it's actually a fairly complicated problem, so we're going to take this one nice and slow. In this problem you have quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies, so there's actually 4 subjects. That's unusual for me to give you one this hard with that many subjects, but frankly I always push you a little harder on these review sheets. If you had one more penny, Luann, the number of pennies would be half the number of nickels. So we've got pennies and we've got nickels. And in this case, what I'm talking about is simply the number of coins. If I tell you that if you had one more penny, the number of pennies would be half the number of nickels, I've described which coin in terms of the other.
The pennies.
In terms of the
nickels.
So my unknown will be the nickels. X. Now, this one's a tough one, and I'm going to assume that you just don't see what you put down for the number of pennies. And what I want you to do is just make up a number for the number of nickels. So in this case, how many nickels would you like there to be?
8.
8 would be a fine choice. Now what we're saying is, pretend for a minute that there are 8 nickels. If you had one more penny, again, you don't have that one more penny, but if you did have one more penny, then the number of pennies you would have would be half of 8.
Which would be 4.
So you must have how many pennies?
3.
Because if you had one more penny, you have 3. If you had one more, that would be 4, and that would be equal to half the number of nickels. Now, how did you do the calculation for 3? How did you come up with that?
8 divided by 2.
And since we specifically, well actually, you know what? I'm going to let you get away with that. We really said half, but dividing by 2 is essentially the same as taking half, so that's fine. We take our 8 divided by 2, and in this case, that would give us 4, and then you subtracted 1. Now you'll see what I started to do there. It wasn't really an 8 to begin with, was it, Luann? What was it really?
An X.
So where you had the 8, we're just going to go back and put in the X. And my number of pennies would be the number of nickels divided by 2 minus 1. So I now have the number of pennies. So how about the number of dimes? What do I tell you about the number of dimes? If there was just one more, there is just one more nickel than the number of dimes. So the number of nickels is one more than this. So if there were 8 nickels, how many dimes would there be? The number of nickels is one more than the number of dimes. There are more nickels than there are dimes. So if there are 8 nickels and you have one more of them, the number of dimes must be
7.
And how did you calculate the 7?
8 minus 1.
In this case, we merely took our 8 and we subtracted 1 from it. But again, the 8 is a made-up number, so we're just going to put in
X minus 1.
Very good. So at this point, our pretend numbers, by the way, would be 3, 8, and 7. The last thing that I tell you is that the number of quarters is such that if you had 3 more quarters, there would be as many quarters as everything else combined. Well, everything else is 3, 8, and 7. If you had 3 more quarters, it would be the same as the total of all of those. How would we determine how many quarters we need to have if there's 3 pennies, 8 nickels, and 7 dimes?
You add the 3 and the 8 and the 7.
If we add those coins together, the 3, the 8, and the 7, that would give us a total of 18 coins. Now the number of quarters, remember, is such that if there was 3 more, then we'd have the same number, 18. So to figure out how many quarters there are, what do?
You have to subtract 3.
So in this case, there's 18 of everything else. Subtracting 3 would leave me with 15 quarters. Now remember where these came from, and I really haven't left myself enough room, so I'm going to move down a line here. You added up the number of pennies, the number of nickels, and the number of dimes. Well, algebraically, how many pennies did we have?
X divided by 2 minus 1.
Plus the number of nickels.
X.
plus the number of dimes,
x minus 1.
all of that, the sum of all of those, minus 3. I'm going to make things a little bit easier on myself here. First of all, half of x, or x divided by 2, is the same as 0.5x. So if I have 1x plus 1 more x plus 0.5x, my number of quarters is actually 2.5x. And minus 1, and minus 3 all simplifies to?
Minus 5.
So, now what's the only other piece of information that I have on this problem?
They all equal $8.
So what you're really telling me is the dollar value of the coins. And what you just gave me was the total of the dollar value is 8. In this case, I think I'm actually going to put it as cents. I wrote dollars, but I think it'll be easier for me if I write it down in cents, so I have all whole numbers. So, notice first of all my total line here, and I'm trying to squeeze it in here, and I do apologize. But I don't care about the number of coins. It's really irrelevant. You can leave blanks on your total line all you want. What you're not allowed to have is blanks on your chart. So up here, simply, if I had 3 pennies, Luann, what would the dollar value or cent value of those 3 pennies be?
3 cents.
So if I have 3 pennies, I have 3 cents. They're the same thing. So x over 2 minus 1 is my value of the pennies. So x over 2 minus 1 would be the value in cents. Now, what if I had 8 nickels, Luann? What would that value be?
8 nickels would be 40 cents.
40 cents. And how did you get that?
8 times 5.
And of course, we made up the 8. So instead of taking 5 times 8, you'll merely take 5 times
X.
Because again, the 8 was simply taking the place of that x, remember? Now, what if you had 7 dimes? How much would that be worth?
That'd be worth 70
And
cents.
how did you get the 70?
7 times 10.
And again, we made up the 7. So instead of 10 times 7, we'll have 10 times, where'd the 7 come from? The 7 was just taking place of the x minus 1 for a minute. So we'll have 10 times x minus 1. And finally, can you just figure out how we're going to find the value for the quarters? This, remember, was our simplified number of quarters. We nearly take that number times what, Luann?
25.
Because quarters are, of course, worth 25 cents apiece. And can you see what our equation is now?
We're going to add all those up together to equal 800.
So I literally take, down here, the value of my pennies plus the value of my nickels, and in the interest of time and more or less, actually more in the interest of space here, I'm going to go ahead and distribute my dimes. 10 times x is 10x, and 10 times minus 1 is minus 10. So I'll just put my dimes down as 10x minus 10. And finally, I'm going to play the same trick here with my 25. I'm going to go ahead and distribute. 25 times 2.5 is 6.25x, and of course that would be positive. Minus 5 times 25 would be minus 125, and the value of all those coins added together has to equal 800. Now let's go ahead and do some simplification here again. I basically have, I'm sorry, I put the decimal point in the wrong place here. That should be 62.5. Basically, at this point, if I simplify and I combine all my x terms, my 62.5x, my 10x would be 72.5, plus 5 would be 77.5, and remember, it's easier, I think, to go ahead and think of that as 0.5x. Gives me a total of 78x. And if I combine my numbers, I've got a minus 1, a minus 10, and a minus 125. That gives me a total of minus 136. And again, I still have 800 on the right side of my equation.
You want to check that one. I don't think that one's right.
No, I'm pretty sure that one's right, Luann. Let's try it again to be sure. 62 plus 10 would be 72. 72 plus 5 would be 77. And remember, I had essentially two halves here, half an x and half an x, which gave me another whole x, or 78x.
Okay, I was looking at this decimal in the wrong
Right,
place.
but remember that was the wrong place.
Right,
It was supposed to
right.
be 62.5. The decimal
Okay.
point should have been between the 2 and the 5. That was my error,
Okay.
and I do apologize. If I add both sides, 136, over here on the right side, that will give me 936, and over on the left side, I have 78x. Finally, my last step, and I'm really going to squeeze it in here, would be to divide both sides by 78. Now, dividing both sides of this by 78 tells me that x equals 12. Going back to the top, that means my number of pennies would be x divided by 2, or 6, minus 1, means that this value is really 5. Of course, my x, I know, is 12. X minus 1, instead of being 7, turns out to be 11. And 2.5, or 2.5 times 12, would be 30, minus 5 means I have 25 quarters. Now, the answer to this question is, what was the value of quarters, I believe. In this case, all you would need to do would be to multiply the number of quarters times 25. That would give me $6.25. And I'm going to abandon the whole number aspect now and just go ahead and list these as decimals. My 11 dimes would be worth $1.10. My 12 nickels would be worth 60 cents. And finally, my 5 pennies would be worth 5 cents. If I add these up, I have 65, $1.75, plus $6.25 is indeed $8. So there's all the information, and again, in this particular case, I believe my question was, what was the value of the quarters? And I have actually lied to you. The actual question was, how many dimes are there? In this case, the number of dimes was merely 11. And again, I apologize for my lack of memory there, but I could ask you any of these things from the chart. My question could have been, what's the value of the nickels? What's the value of the quarters? What's the number of pennies? Any of these pieces of information can be actually asked in the question. You just need to pick off the proper piece of information from your chart, and you'll have your solution.